Hey guys, welcome back to more HOA stories. Imagine building a wheelchair ramp for your disabled dad, only to get slapped with a $200 per day fine from your homeowner association. Now picture them telling you to hide him in the garage so he is not visible from the street. Let's dive right into this crazy HOA story. And today's HOA Prorevenge story starts like this. I never really thought much about my HOA until my dad's wheelchair ramp became their favorite problem. For context, my dad is not the fragile, helpless type people imagine when they hear disabled. He is stubborn as hell, worked blue collar his whole life, fixed his own cars, and climbed on his own roof way past the age that he should have. But then he had a medical issue that landed him in a wheelchair, and now he can sort of stand and pivot if he's holding onto something, but walking more than a step or two is done. After a long hospital stay and rehab, it was obvious that his old house just was not gonna work anymore. Too many steps, tight hallways, everything cramped and uneven, and I offered to have him move in with me. My place is in a quiet suburb, nothing special, but open enough that we could make it work. He did the whole "I don't wanna be a burden" speech, because of course he did, but it was either that or leave him to struggle alone. Well, the one major problem with my house was the front entrance. There's a short set of steps up to a little porch, and for most people, it's no big deal. For my dad in a wheelchair, it's basically a wall. We looked into a portable aluminum ramps, but to get a safe slope, it would have had to be pretty long. Trying to drag that out and line it up every time, then stash it again, it would have been a nightmare. Plus, it would be easy to misplace or set up wrong, and I didn't want him relying on something that flimsy or makeshift every single day. So we decided on a permanent wooden ramp from the driveway up to the porch. Sturdy, fixed, and safe. Nothing crazy or decorative, but before building anything, I actually called the city. I'm decent with tools, but I'm not trying to wing it with something my dad's life literally depends on. I told the person at the building department, hey, my dad's in a wheelchair now and I need to add a ramp to my front entrance. Do I need a permit or anything for that, and are there any rules I need to follow? The guy on the phone was nicer than I expected. He emailed me a couple PDFs with guidelines about slope, width, landing space, railing heights, stuff like that. He said that for a small residential ramp like this attached to an existing porch, they did not require a formal permit, but I should follow the basic safety and accessibility recommendations, which are based on ADA standards, so that's what I did. I spent a few evenings measuring everything, sketching out a plan, overthinking whether the slope would feel comfortable for him. Over a weekend I built the ramp, pressure-treated wood, proper footings, non-slip treads, handrail on the side. It's not some Pinterest project, but it's solid and doesn't look bad at all. The first time I rolled my dad up that ramp into the house, he just sat there on the porch for a minute, took a deep breath and said, "Didn't think I'd be going up steps again." You could see the relief. That porch became his go-to spot. He would sit there, watch the street, complain about the weather, talk to neighbors, and for the first time in a while, it felt like he had a life outside the four walls of a rehab facility. Well, for about a week, everything was fine, but then I met my HOA for real. Just so you understand, our neighborhood has one of those planned community HOAs. When I bought the house, I flipped through the CC&Rs, shrugged and figured it was the usual stuff. I mean, keep your lawn somewhat mowed, don't park a boat on your roof, that kind of thing. Before this, the only time they bothered me was a form letter about my grass being slightly over community standards after a week of non-stop rain. Annoying, but whatever really. One day, there's an envelope in my mailbox from the HOA. Inside is a notice of violation, unauthorized structure. So, according to the homeowner association, the ramp is an unapproved exterior modification that so-called alters the uniform appearance of the community. It says I failed to submit an architectural request before installation, and then it says I have 14 days to remove or bring the property into compliance, or they will start fining me $200 per day until I do. Imagine that, $200 a day over a wheelchair ramp. At first, I thought I misread. I actually held the letter up to the light like that was gonna help. At the bottom of the letter is the number for the management company that handles all the admin stuff for the HOA. I call and sit through that endless phone tree until a woman finally answers. I give her my name and address and ask what specifically is non-compliant about the ramp. She looks up my file and says something along the lines of, "The board determined that you made an exterior structural change without prior approval by the architectural committee and that the ramp doesn't fit the community's aesthetic." I explain, calmly at first, that it's not a decorative project, it's a wheelchair ramp for my disabled father. I tell her that I called the city before building and that they said no permit was required and gave me guidelines and that the ramp follows those. It's safe, well built, and my dad literally cannot get in and out of the house independently without it. She does the whole "I understand, but" thing and tells me that I will need to discuss it with the board directly and that I can attend the next HOA meeting. She gives me the date and time, so then I ask point blank, "Are you telling me the HOA really intends to fine me $200 a day if I don't remove my dad's wheelchair ramp?" There's a pause. Then she says, "Those are the fines specified in the current violation schedule for unapproved exterior structures. I cannot change that. You would have to request a hearing with the board." I hang up and just stand there in the kitchen staring at the wall. My dad, who heard enough to put it together, asks, "What's going on?" I tell him. He looks down at his hands for a second and in this small, frustrated voice says, "Well, we can find another way to get me in. I don't want you in trouble over this." It pissed me off that he immediately felt guilty for existing, but I told him, "No, this is not you causing trouble, this is them being idiots. You're not crawling up some side entrance because they don't like looking at a ramp." That night I pull out the binder from when I bought the house and dig up the CC&Rs. I actually read them properly this time. There's a clause that says any visible exterior modification needs prior approval from the so-called architectural committee. It essentially talks about fences, sheds, paint colors, additions, that kind of stuff. There's absolutely nothing specific about accessibility or disability accommodations, no mention of ramps at all. I start a folder on my laptop and a literal manila folder because if they're threatening $200 a day, I want everything in one place. I throw in the violation letters, screenshots of the email from the city, pictures of the ramp from different angles, and I start a little log of dates, who I talked to, etc. I also email the HOA's generic board address, politely explaining the situation and asking for a copy of whatever standard they believe I violated. Of course, there was no reply. The next HOA meeting is about a week and a half away. I email again asking to be added to the agenda, but no response. Whatever. I mark the date on my calendar and show up anyway. The meeting is held in a small clubhouse by the entrance to the neighborhood. I walk in and there are maybe 20 people there, all in folding chairs facing a long table at the front. 5 board members sit there with stacks of papers and plastic water bottles. The president is exactly what you expect from every HOA horror story you see on here. Polished, late 40s maybe, perfectly done bob haircut, crisp blues, a big binder, and this permanent tight smile that does not even reach her eyes. I'm just gonna call her Karen. They go through the formal agenda first: budget, landscaping contract, some community barbecue thing, a complaint about someone's dog off leash. I sit there, waiting, ramping up my annoyance in my head. Eventually, they get to homeowner comments. I raise my hand, stand up when they acknowledge me, and quickly explain who I am and why I'm actually there. I tell them my dad is disabled and uses a wheelchair, and that I built a ramp so he can safely get in and out of the house. I also said I followed the city's guidelines. The city told me no permit was needed. Then I received a notice threatening $200 a day in fines if I don't remove or relocate the ramp. While I'm talking, I've already hit record on my phone in my pocket. Our state is a one-party consent state, and after that first letter I decided I was not trusting them to summarize anything accurately. At first the board tries to keep it bland and procedural. They say I should have submitted an architectural form before altering the front elevation. They talk about community aesthetics and keeping the neighborhood's look cohesive. You can tell they keep things vague. I push back a little and explain that my dad was being discharged from rehab and I was not gonna make him sit in a facility for weeks while a bunch of volunteers decided whether they like the look of a ramp or not. Also, I point out that the ramp is not some giant metal monstrosity, it's just a basic wooden ramp that blends in about as much as anything else can. That is when Karen cannot help herself anymore. She looks at me and says, in that awful voice, "You have to understand, lots of families in this community deal with aging parents, mobility issues, things like that. Many of them have found ways to accommodate those needs without, changing the appearance of the front of the property." I ask her, like what exactly? She says, well, you could use a small portable ramp that you put away when it's not in use, or assist him up the steps. Or bring him in through the garage or a side entrance so it's not so visible from the street. We just have to balance individual situations with the overall look of the community. There's this little silence in the room after she says, "not so visible from the street." A couple of people shift in their seats, one guy looks down at his shoes like he doesn't want to be there anymore. And by the way guys, I actually agree. I would also want to balance the look of the community by not having Karens roam around freely in the streets. That would definitely improve the look of the community. And by the way guys, if you enjoy these HOA stories, please don't forget to like the video and tell me in the comments where you are watching from today. It really helps me a lot. Anyway, I take a second so I don't lose it and then say, so what you're telling me is that my dad should be carried upstairs or hidden in the garage so people don't have to see his wheelchair at the front door. That's your solution? She immediately says, "No, that's not what I said. You're taking my words out of context. We are just asking what you follow the established process and keep modifications in line with the community's appearance." One of the other board members, an older guy with glasses, kind of quietly coughs and mumbles something about reasonable accommodation. But then she glances over at him, he shuts up. I hold up the printed email from the city and say, "The city inspector sent me these guidelines and told me no permit is needed as long as I build safely. The ramp is built to those guidelines. It is safe, but you're threatening me with hundreds of dollars a day in fines because you don't like how it looks." She repeats that rules are rules and that I should have gone through proper channels, and suggests again that I can submit an architectural request now or explore alternative locations for the ramp. It's obvious I'm not going to get anywhere with them tonight, so I say, alright, thank you for your time. I'll be following up with the city and with people who understand disability law better than I do. Then I sit down and they move on to the next item, like we were not just discussing whether my dad should be shoved through a garage. On the drive home I replay that line in my head, "Bring him through the garage so it's not so visible from the street." And my anger goes from a simmer to a rolling boil. That is the moment it really clicks that to them, this is not about safety at all. It seemed like it's about not wanting a visible reminder of disability. The next morning I take the day off work and go to the city building department in person. I bring a thick stack of papers, the violation letter, the emails from the city guy who sent me ramp guidelines, and a bunch of printed photos of the ramp from every angle. The inspector who comes to the counter is this older guy in a city polo shirt, tape measure clip on his belt. I lay everything out and explain as calmly as I can the whole situation. I tell him I'm worried the HOA is misrepresenting what the city requires and using code as an excuse to go after us. He looks at the photos for a while, reads the HOA letter, and does that long exhale people do when they are too professional to say, "You gotta be kidding me," out loud. He says something like, "We get pulled into HOA disputes more than you would think." But from what I'm seeing here, the city didn't tell you to remove this and it looks like you followed the guidelines that we sent. I ask if he'd be willing to come inspect it himself and if it's okay, put something in writing that says that from the city's standpoint the ramp is fine and doesn't violate anything. He thinks for a second and says, "Yeah, I can do that. I'll come by this week, take measurements, and if everything matches the guidelines we gave you, I will send you a note on letterhead so there's no confusion here." A couple days later, he is at my house. He spends about 20 minutes checking it out. He measures the slope, checks the width, makes sure the landings are deep enough, looks at how it's attached to the porch, he takes a few photos, asks a couple of clarifying questions, and that's it. Before he leaves, he says, "This is well done. I will write up that it meets our residential accessibility and safety guidelines, and from the city perspective, you're good." About a week later, I get an email from him with a letter attached. It says he inspected the ramp on whatever date, that it's consistent with the city's residential guidelines, and that no additional permit is needed for that configuration, and that the city has no objection to it being there. He CCs the HOA's email address. I send a quick reply thanking him. Then I wait to see what the HOA does, and for a couple days there's silence. Then another envelope appears in my mailbox. This one basically says in bureaucratic language that despite your communication with the city, the ramp remains non-compliant with community architectural standards. They tell me I got two options: remove it and restore the front entrance to its previously approved state, or relocate or otherwise screen the ramp so it's not prominently visible from the street. And now they give me a specific date when fines will actually start, $200 per day after that date. So they got the city's letter, saw that there's no code issue, and doubled down anyway. At that point, I'm done trying to reason with them on my own. That night, I start Googling HOA wheelchair ramp discrimination, reasonable accommodation HOA ramp, that sort of thing. Eventually, I land on some government and non-profit sites that explain that housing providers, including HOAs, are often required to allow reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities, especially when it comes to access and mobility. I find a local disability rights organization that deals with fair housing issues. They got an intake form online where you can describe your problem and upload documents, so I dump everything there. The HOA letters, pictures of the ramp, the city inspector's letter, and a short write-up of what the HOA president said at the meeting about using the garage so it's not so visible. A couple days later, they email me back and ask if we can schedule a phone call. On the call, I talk to an advocate who clearly has heard way too many stories like mine. I walked him through the whole thing from start to finish, my dad's condition moving him in, building the ramp, the city guidelines, the HOA's letters, that meeting, all of it. I tell him that my dad lives with me full-time now, and I mentioned the exact phrases the president used. The advocate is quiet for a bit and then says, "There are a lot of concerning things here. Ramps and similar modifications for people who use wheelchairs are textbook examples of reasonable accommodations in a lot of fair housing cases. And when someone in a position of authority starts talking about hiding a disability from the view, that's usually not good for them, legally speaking." They explain that they can send a formal letter to the HOA on my father's behalf, since he's the one with the disability, requesting a reasonable accommodation and laying out the relevant laws. They say most HOAs suddenly get a lot more flexible once they realize this is not just a neighborly argument anymore, it's a potential legal problem. I talked to my dad about it that evening, and he's torn. On one hand, he hates confrontation, but on the other, his eyes harden a bit when I remind him the president basically said they would prefer he comes in through a side entrance like the help. He sighs and says, "If they're going to treat me like something to hide, I'm not just gonna roll over." Do it. So we give the non-profit permission to proceed. Within about a week, the HOA gets a letter from an attorney working with a disability rights group. The letter, which I saw later, is pretty straightforward. It says that my dad is disabled, that he needs the ramp for access, and that the ramp is safe and has been reviewed by the city, and that refusing or penalizing a necessary accessibility modification can violate fair housing and disability laws. It formally asks the HOA to treat the ramp as a reasonable accommodation and to stop threatening fines or removal. I don't know exactly what happened behind closed doors after that, but the tone changed quickly. I got a short email from the HOA saying that the board is reviewing the matter with council and that any fines will be held in abeyance until their review is complete. Translation: they hit the brakes on the $200 per day threat. From that point on, most of the action happens above my pay grade. The HOA's insurance company gets involved too, and their lawyer gets involved. The nonprofit's lawyer handles most of the communications. My job is basically to answer questions, forward emails, and keep my dad updated without stressing him out too much. This part is not exactly fast, it drags out over months. There are long stretches where I hear nothing, and then the advocate will call and ask for some random piece of info, like the date my dad officially moved in or copies of any new letters. I go to one more HOA meeting during all of this, and the issue does not get discussed in open session, but you can feel it in the air. Attendance is lighter than usual, the board looks tense. At one point, when they are reviewing the projected budget for next year, someone in the audience asks why the line for legal expensive is higher than last year. The treasurer shifts in his seat and says, "We've had some unexpected legal costs related to a homeowner dispute." He doesn't say who or what, but a few people look around and more than one pair of eyes briefly flick towards me. Eventually, things escalate a little further. The advocate calls and says, "We think your case is strong. If your dad is willing, we can move forward with a formal complaint and a lawsuit. It's very likely the HOA will choose to settle, and that usually involves some combination of monetary compensation and policy changes." I relay that to my dad, and he sits with it for a few days, and finally he tells me, "I didn't want any of this, but if we just let it go, they will do it to the next person who needs a ramp. So yeah, let's see it through." So we go forward. There's no big day in court moment. That's not how most of these things end up. Once a formal complaint is filed and it's clear the nonprofit has real lawyers who know this stuff, the HOA's insurance people start pushing for a settlement instead of gambling on a trial. I'm not in most of those conversations. What I get are periodic updates from the advocate. "They've offered X, we've countered with Y, we are asking for policy language changes, not just money." That kind of thing. When it's finally settled, the agreement looks something like this. My dad gets a monetary payment for what they put him through, nothing that would let him buy a yacht, but very real money that says, yes, we screwed up. The HOA formally approved the existing ramp as a reasonable accommodation in writing, with no more threats or fines. They gotta revise their policies to include a clear process for disability accommodations, including ramps and similar modifications. And the board members have to go through some training on fair housing and disability rights. Again, I'm purposely not putting specific numbers here, but it was significant enough that you would absolutely feel it if you were an HOA budgeting for the year. Of course, that money doesn't come out of thin air. Some of it comes from the insurance, some of it comes from the HOA itself. Either way, it's ultimately paid for by the community. So next budget cycle, the dues go up even further. Not by hundreds of dollars, but by enough that people notice, and when the board holds the annual meeting, a lot more people show up than usual. Now there's a new energy in the room, not just boredom or indifference, but annoyance. People start asking pretty pointed questions like, why are legal costs so much higher? What homeowner dispute costs so much? Are we gonna keep paying for this kind of thing every time the board gets into a power struggle over aesthetics? Because people talk, and because the disability rights group is not exactly a small secret organization, word spreads. I don't go house to house handing out flyers or anything, but when neighbors ask me what happened with that ramp situation, I'm honest. I tell them the city said the ramp was fine, the HOA kept pushing, and a disability rights group got involved, and the HOA ended up settling and rewriting some rules. A few neighbors I barely knew before came up to me to say they're sorry we had to go through that. One mentions that his mom uses a walker and he's now worried about what would happen if she moved in. Another says she voted for the current board but didn't sign up to pay higher dues because someone doesn't like looking at a wheelchair. Eventually, a few of the more proactive homeowners put together a petition for a special meeting to recall some of the board members. Most HOAs have a process for this buried in their governing documents, like get signatures from a certain percentage of homeowners, force a recall vote. They're not doing it purely for my dad. They're doing it because they're sick of silly violation letters, mad about dues going up, and embarrassed that the whole neighborhood got dragged into a fair housing dispute over a ramp. But my dad's ramp is the story everyone points to as the turning point, and the special meeting was packed. Instead of 20 bored people, there are now 50, 60, maybe more. The tone is very different. People are pissed and they've had months to stew on it. Homeowners line up to speak, some are calmer, some are visibly angry, and they ask why the board didn't just approve a reasonable accommodation from the start. And they ask why they were talking about aesthetics instead of basic human decency. And they ask why their dues are going up because of what one person called a war on a wheelchair ramp. One of the board members tries to spin it as a miscommunication and says that they were just trying to uphold community standards. Another trots out something about protecting property values, and that goes over like a lead balloon. An older woman in the back, who I've seen walking slowly with a cane before, literally says out loud for the whole room to hear, "I care less about my property value and more about not treating disabled people like trash." A bunch of people clap. When the actual recall vote happens, it's not even close. The president is removed, the treasurer is removed, one of the other board members resigns a week later. New people run and get voted in, people who, from the way they talk, are mostly interested in keeping the neighborhood clean and sane, not in micromanaging who can have a ramp. A few months after that, a for sale sign shows up in front of the ex-president's house. No big drama, no goodbye email. One day she's there, the next she is not. I have no idea where she went and I honestly don't care. Meanwhile, my dad still lives with me. He still uses the ramp every day, he still sits on the porch when the weather is decent, watching people walk their dogs and kids ride bikes. Delivery drivers bring packages up the ramp without a second thought. Neighbors use it when they come to the door. It's just part of the house now, like it always should have been. The next one is another fantastic malicious compliance story, and this one is titled, "One of my early jobs was managing the backend server and database for a desktop/laptop file backup systems. A very big company, and we had all the sales and management laptops on regular backup schedules. Often the database would crash and we would have to rebuild it. This meant restoring files using the automated process was offline for a few hours to sometimes a few days. Management put out a notice that any restore requests must get my manager's approval before we did a manual restore. Most times it could wait for a day or so. This one sales guy insisted that we restore his supercritical sales documents immediately though, or else he would escalate to senior management. My manager told him to wait for one more day, but nope, he went straight to the CTO and got his way. So as part of the manual restore process, we print out the complete file list of what we would be restoring and copied all the files to a DVD that was to be sent to the user. 95% of the files that were to be restored were PORN pics and videos with a few Word documents and spreadsheets. So after printing the 20+ page file report and burning the DVD, I took it to my manager. She smiled and immediately set an appointment with the CTO. Needless to say, the sales guy had a very intense meeting with the CTO, sales VP and HR. I heard he denied to the end those files were his. I wonder what he told his wife when he had to look for another job. And the next one is a petty revenge story, which is titled "Don't Assume Others Don't Speak Spanish." So I'm a bridal stylist. I help people find their wedding gown. I love my job, and 99% of the time it's a happy, wonderful job with great coworkers and customers. But then there's the 1%. I had a bride today who was very sweet but just didn't connect with the gowns we had. That's okay, it happens sometimes, she was fine, but her mom, and somehow it is always the mom or the aunt, was decidedly not happy and decided to crap talk me in Spanish the whole time. "Does this woman know what she's doing? She's pulling nothing but ugly gowns." Said gowns were selected by the bride, by the way. "I hope you don't ever get as fat as her." And so on. Just lovely. Now for context, I am whiter than a jar of mayo, and I don't necessarily look like I speak Spanish. However, my parents are from a Spanish-speaking country. Even though they are not ethnically Hispanic, I know a lot more as a kid, but I still know enough to get around. So I waited until the end, and as they were leaving, I said, "I hope you have a great day. Please feel free to come back anytime you would like. We have lots more gowns you can go through if you would like." In Spanish, to the bride, her mom, and oh man. You know how good it feels when you're in a ton of pain and the doctor finally gives you something that works and you're suddenly not feeling any pain anymore, or when you're craving the hell out of a specific flavor of ice cream and you manage to find it. Yeah, seeing the look on that bride's mom's face when she realized I heard and understood the entire hour of her ripping me to shreds was so much better. And yeah guys, thank you for watching. I will see you again tomorrow.